First of all, my name is Dr. Sarah Olutola, Assistant Professor of Writing at Lakehead University, specifically at the Aurelia campus. So I'm representing for Aurelia. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you all here, and it's an honor to have our panelists here. I'll be the moderator today for our webinar entitled, "Are Canadian Universities Doing Enough to Defend Outspoken Racialized Faculty?" So if that's what you're expecting, you're in the right place. Before the beginning of the webinar, I first want to acknowledge that Lakehead University is located on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. So Lakehead's campus in Thunder Bay is located on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. Lakehead's campus in Aurelia is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. So we at Lakehead University acknowledge the history that many nations hold in the areas around our campus, and we are committed to a relationship with First Nations people, Métis and Inuit peoples, based on the principles of mutual trust, respect, reciprocity, and collaboration in the spirit of reconciliation. I do also want to take the time to thank our sponsors as well. So this event is possible thanks to the support of Lakehead University's Office of Research Services and the Office of Human Rights and Equity through funding provided by NSERC, EDI, Institutional Capacity Building Grant. The event is also co-sponsored by the Association of Canadian College and University Teachers of English, ACUTE. So thank you for all of our sponsors. Thank you for those of you who promoted the event. And thank you for attending. So we're here today to talk about whether or not Canadian universities are doing enough to support outspoken racialized faculty. Now, what does that mean? In our increasingly polarized times, outspoken racialized faculty at Canadian universities, especially those who speak and write publicly on sensitive issues, have increasingly become the targets of various forms of harassment. And we've seen examples of this across North America, right? Of academic institutions perhaps buckling under political or economic or administrative pressure to censor and control certain racialized voices in academic spaces. But these voices are important now than ever. So we're here to discuss whether or not current equity, diversity, and inclusion policies are sufficient to address these situations. What can universities do, and what should universities be doing to really ensure that racialized faculty and other faculty allies can challenge dominant paradigms without risking our jobs and without risking our well-being? So this is a conversation that has greater implications for the principle of academic freedom and the role of the public intellectual. That's what we're going to be discussing today. And we're gathered here to have a respectful discussion, especially because we are going to be discussing experiences of racialized people in academia. So I would like to remind people that this will remain a safe space for discussion and should remain a safe space for discussion and a respectful environment for the panelists and for the viewers. So a little bit about the format. So this panel will approximately be 2 hours, consisting of a 1-hour panelist discussion and a 45-minute Q&A. I will be asking our panelists 3 broad main questions. Each panelist will have time to give their thoughts on these 3 questions, and hopefully there'll be some crosstalk, some follow-up questions in a way that we can sort of converse with each other. That'll be according to the flow of the conversation. For attendees, you actually can ask questions. So if you have a question, you can type that question into the Q&A box. If you have a question directed towards a specific panelist, please indicate this. We will be vetting the questions just for safety reasons. If you'd like to actually come up on stage and ask your questions live, please just indicate this in your question itself by writing live in all caps, so that we'll know to bring you up as a speaker to ask your questions. For accessibility, this webinar will be recorded and transcripts will be enabled, and a recording will be made available on Lakehead University's English Department YouTube channel shortly. So now to introduce our panelists, and I can't thank you guys enough for joining us today. I'm very excited. Dr. Lily Cho is the Associate Dean of Global and Community Engagement at York University. Her research focuses on diasporic subjectivity within the fields of cultural studies, post-colonial literature and theory, and Asian, North American, and Canadian literature. She's the author of Mass Capture, Chinese Head Texts, and The Making of Non-Citizens in Canada, and Eating Chinese, Culture of the Menu in Small Town Canada. Her current project, Asian Values, Fictions of Finance and Beautiful Money, explores diasporic movement and theories of value within post-colonial Asia. We also have joining us Dr. Elle Jones. Elle is a poet, a journalist, a professor, and an abolitionist living in Halifax. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax and a 2015 resident of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. Elle was the poet in residence at U of T Scarborough in 2021. And she won 2 Atlantic Journalism Gold Awards in 2018 and 2019. She was the 15th Nancy's Chair in Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. She received her PhD in Cultural Studies at Queen's University and is currently the assistant professor in the Department of Political and Canadian Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. Dr. A.J. Parasam is an associate professor in the Department of International Development Studies, History, and Political Science. He studies structural forms of violence, for example, race, caste, class, patriarchy, rooted or exacerbated through imperial encounters that have been sanitized of their colonial histories and normalized in the present day. He is also a founding fellow at the McEakin, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Institute of Public Policy and Governance, and served as the chair and program chair of the Global Development Section of the International Studies Association between 2019 and 2020. And finally, Dr. Lana Ray is a part of the Lakehead University family. So she is the Indigenous Research Chair in Decolonial Futures at Lakehead University. She's an associate professor in the Department of Indigenous Learning and the director of the Anishinaabe Kindesiwin Institution, the AKI, at Lakehead University. Previously, she worked as the director of policy and research at a provincial Indigenous organization, and she continues to work to advance Indigenous social, cultural, and political realities. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. So like I said, I'm going to give everyone a chance to answer 3 main questions. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to address the question before we move on to the next, and we'll try and be a little strict with time here. So without further ado, I'd like to ask the first question, which is the reason why we're all here, right? Are Canadian universities doing enough to support racialized faculty? And if it's okay, I'd like to start with you, AJ.
Sure, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Can you imagine if I just said yes and passed it on? I thought about doing that, but no. I mean, so thank you. I really appreciate this invitation. I'm coming to you from Mi'kmaq unceded Mi'kmaq territories in this unsightly dungeon of a basement. Apologies for that. But yeah, when I was thinking about how to approach answering this question, I spent an astonishingly long amount of time trying to think about how to answer this very seemingly basic question. And the closest thing to a good answer I could come up with was that universities want our bodies, but they don't want our minds. And that separation of body and mind is, I think, more it's more than just the tokenism is, I think, probably something that we're all familiar with, but this particular panel is talking about outspoken racialized colleagues. So I think that there's an extra level at play in the question and the framing. So I don't think that people are purposefully seeking our bodies but not our minds. They might think that they're after both, and I think individuals are genuinely probably after both. And then there's always these structural institutional constraints that prevent things like, the simple solution is always hire more people, right? But that doesn't in and of itself change the institutional practice and culture. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So I don't think that people do it on purpose, but I think that it's the logical outcome of asking racialized folks to perform remedial catch-up training intended to teach other people about what it's like to experience the world from one or more positions of marginality, instead of that person, doing their research or doing whatever it is, going to the gym or whatever keeps them happy and healthy. And it would be different if institutions en masse were prepared to change fundamentally how they operate. I don't think that they are. I think that many institutions believe that they are interested in that. But anyway, you'll see what I'm getting at. So when racialized faculty are asked to do diversity work all the time, and it's not just diversity work, but I'll use that as an example. Oftentimes the diversity work gets stymied because there's insufficient financial resources to support the work, and there's no mechanism to convince the more recalcitrant colleagues who might still believe that maybe we don't deserve to be faculty members in the first place. Because it's an awkward thing to confront, but I mean, we're in a safe space here after all. So that's the reality of it, is that not all of our colleagues are wonderful, and some of them really don't think that we should be here, and it just gets exacerbated every time that we are outspoken. So that's part of the reality of how racialized faculty engage their workplaces. Where was I here? So yeah, like the folks who are not supporting the idea of diversity or changing the way we do things are the ones who are the most dedicated to not changing how they engage with their discipline, engage with their faculties, or confront or ignore, rather, the epistemological and ontological violences that has systematically privileged a particular way of doing university work for generations and generations. Now, to even say something like that, that's kind of scary shit, right? Like, that's not just the kind of conventional thing that you would expect to hear. It's one thing if a person is just looking for a seat at the table, right? And that's why I take the invocation here to talk about outspoken racialized faculties quite seriously, because not everybody is outspoken, and some people do just want a seat at the table, and we shouldn't, like that's a separate thing. But I think for people who are outspoken, we don't want to just sit at the table gratefully. So how does a bureaucratic institution make sure that our more dangerous, threatening views can remain marginalized while we can continue to increase, representation on statistical reports? Keep them busy, put them on a committee, tell them that they're valued, but fail to demonstrate that you value them in material ways. And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about time. I'm talking about movement. The volume. This is not going to be news to anybody here, probably, but the volume of service work that we are expected to do officially is one thing, and then all the stuff that we do unofficially, we do it because we're happy to do it, because we're committed to that work, but it's not measured and it's not valued by our metrics. I've taught free directed reading classes every single semester that I've been a professor. That's 7 years now running. Students who aren't even in my class will come to my office hours and basically try to heal from the trauma of being in other people's classes, talking about their histories in like really awful ways, triggering ways for them. We all do this. I think we all do this kind of work. So I'll wrap up just to say that, I think the last point that I'd want to make on this is that doing this kind of work without the institutional support to actually make this work effective makes it so that we are also stepping away from advancing our careers as everybody else is, so it stunts our ability to do research, to publish research, to win grants, and thus the disciplines that we work in are harmed as well. And most of us will do it anyway, and then we just end up working all the time, and it destroys our bodies, our minds, and our family relationships. I didn't even realize I'm on sabbatical right now, but I did not realize until 6 months into my sabbatical that I did not take a day off since 2017. And that's a really messed up thing. That's not something that I'm proud of. It's actually something I'm really ashamed of because of what that means for my family and the people that I care about. In fact, I've even shifted my research interests in order to turn some of the service work that I've been doing into research, because I was concerned that I otherwise wouldn't make the tenure and promotion bar when that eventually came up. So it's like putting aside the stuff that I actually really, really care about to do other work that I sort of care about, but can turn into something that can meet the metrics. So when I say that the universities value our bodies and our presence, but not our minds, this is kind of what I'm getting at. So I guess my answer is no, they're not yet doing enough to support us. Thank you.
No, I really felt that idea of the mind-body split that I think a lot of us have felt. And especially this idea when we zero in on the body, that there's various forms of labor that we're expected to do on top of, being a professor or research. There's all this unspoken labor that we're expected to do. And there isn't enough that the institution is doing to really show in material, tangible ways that we're valued, and also to make sure that we're not being pushed into these other forms of labor just because the department hired a Black girl. So, I'm so curious to continue this conversation. Lana, what do you think about this? And if you have anything to respond to AJ as well.
Miigwech, so Bojo, Weskanagation go Gindigo, Jalkanoji, Nadodam, Paganis and Nadunjaba, Lana Rain Adishnakas. My first time meeting AJ, but I was also thinking, can I respond with just a no? And I think where that came from is something that you just fully know is, and then how do you be able to explain that to others? But I think just the fact that we need to have this conversation and that there is outspoken faculty members shows that institutions aren't doing their job. So if there's outspoken faculty members, it means that there's not systematic efforts in place in regards to, I know this conversation is largely around EDI, but from my perspective, I'll be talking about it more in relation to indigenization, and there's some tensions there, but I don't think we have time to go into all of those today. So yeah, the fact that there has to be very outspoken faculty member in and of itself, to me, says that not enough is being done. And for myself, right, like I would love to get up, come to work, and not have to speak about racism every day, or have to name microaggressions or racism on an ongoing basis. So yeah, I think that's kind of perhaps a way that even outspoken gets normalized, as this is work that perhaps people want to do versus work that people have to do because a larger institution systematically isn't taking responsibility in regard to EDI. So like I said, very much I find universities have created that context, and I think AJ did a really great job of speaking to that as to why Indigenous or racialized faculty members need to be quote unquote outspoken, right? So the lack of diversity, but not just the lack of diversity, maybe the assumption, right, of just wanting people's bodies that every Indigenous person at the table is well versed to speak to EDI and racism and decolonization, all those sorts of things. And it was actually quite wonderful, and it felt really great. I was in a meeting recently, and there was other Indigenous scholars there, and I wasn't the one who all the time had to, you know, every time a comment was made or something was problematic or very much centered in whiteness, not having to be the one who had to call that out every single time. So although representation isn't in and of itself going to solve things, I think it's still an important part of the process. And maybe one piece I will speak to that is perhaps less talked about is the idea of, or thinking about, what context is required for a faculty member to be able to be outspoken. And so there's often this hidden labor that happens in terms of emotional labor and developing social capital. And really, for lack of a better word, having to always be conscious of you're trying to put your best self forward. So you're still your honest self, but the best version of yourself. So to be calculated and regulated. And even in those circumstances, still being characterized as outspoken. So a lot of work goes into, I'm just thinking to Sarah Ahmed's work and how she talks about to be heard as complaining is not to be heard. So having to do this work as an outspoken faculty member, but also to put in all that additional hidden labor that is often unrecognized in an effort for it to be heard and not to simply be seen as a complaint. And then also echo what AJ has said around, right, the cultural tax that we are expected to pay to actually be here within institutions as well. And maybe I'll just share one last story too about my own experience, where there's always that struggle, right? You're often sometimes as outspoken faculty members feeling overworked. Right, I think probably that story that you told, AJ, resonates, of not necessarily something to be proud of, but you know, working 7 days a week and trying to do work that you're called upon to do, because many people see that work as a responsibility as well. But that idea of what happens then if you're not outspoken, which to me goes back to that idea of system responsibility or others taking on that responsibility. And this is something that Shawnee Pete talks about in terms of becoming optional, eliminated, or even a form of silent consent. So often there's this kind of double space that's created where there's the expectation that as a racialized person or that as an Indigenous person, you are in fact outspoken and conditioned to create that. But at the same time, it's this very careful dance of then being outspoken in ways that are still palatable to the institution. So I think that in and of itself is a lot of, you know, it's pretty laborious emotionally and intellectually and spiritually to do that work. So just going back, I said I would share one story. When I went through my tenure process, for example, that was something that was raised, kind of the equity of this cultural tax that I was doing and this outspoken work that I was doing. And so I talked a bit about those circumstances that exist, but one of the comments that came back was me having to learn to say no. And so to me, that was, again, one of those ideas that, again, when we're thinking about outspoken faculty members, really still thinks about that in terms of an individual or individual behaviors or individual traits instead of collecting it or situating it within a larger systemic context. So maybe I'll just leave it there, because I have more I want to say, more so in terms of question 2 and 3 of thinking about solutions, which.
Well, but that was a great start. And I think it's so important that we are actually troubling this word, this term outspoken, and thinking about, well, you know, which bodies, which faculty members, which people in academia actually want to be outspoken versus have to be outspoken because of this larger system of oppression. Elle, what do you think about this topic?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, everybody else so far. Before I make my own comments, I do want to acknowledge that we're in a time of really unprecedented labor actions in universities, particularly with precarious faculty. So we know, of course, that racialized faculty are also concentrated as precarious faculty as well. So this conversation, I hope, also acknowledges that work that's going on right now. I guess I'm just going to be really honest. So I'll just preface by saying that I'm not directing this at any one university, although certainly I can only frame through my own experiences. I was in grad school at the time when the Dell dentistry scandal was going on, and I'm sure I don't need to rehearse the details of that scandal. But the thing that's always haunted me about that is the lengths that the university went to preserve those white men's names that were kept anonymous, to preserve their careers, and to make sure they graduated on time. So, you know, every single one of those men that threatened to chloroform and rape patients and their classmates and wrote, you know, Nazi graffiti, every single one of them got out of Dalhousie on time and now probably lives in a big mansion in, you know, some like privileged area. I, as a Black woman who was, you know, an outspoken Black woman, could not graduate that school and had to leave the province to get a PhD. And I often think about, what is it that I would have to do in my life as a Black woman to rise to the level where I would receive as much care as a white male rapist in the universities that I give my labor to? And that sounds like a harsh comment, but it's something that's actually been very traumatic for me to live with. One of the things I think that's being teased out here, and is actually, I think, an unpopular thing to say, is to recognize the difference between racialized faculty, that not all of us are actually political, and we don't have to be. But one of the things that is the great part of my language mindfuck of post-2020 has been that those of us who are outspoken all along, including through grad school when we were extremely vulnerable, who basically, you know, had to go out in the streets and get arrested, who fought for these things and got labeled troublemakers, then the same people that laid back, called us crazy and disruptive, called us down, excluded us, walked over our backs into those doors, and now get to sit in the top positions. And so many of the people that actually sacrificed their careers and lives never got out of grad school, never got careers, are stranded in junior positions, stranded in precarious positions. And that's a dynamic I think we're not allowed to talk about. And I think we have to start being more honest about these class dynamics within the university as well. It's one reason I've been very critical of EDI, because what does EDI say about political orientation? I'm quite convinced that if I were a Black man who did like database criminology work, that I'd have had a job years ago. I don't think that was the problem. I think the problem is the kind of Black woman I am and the kind of work I do. And I see this among all the other Black women that I'm friends with as well. And not one of us is in a chair or some kind of big position. I'm even lucky now, and I'm greatly blessed now that I was able to make it into a tenure position. But I'm in a tenure position now at a point in my life, I will never catch up on pension. I wasn't able to have a child. And like, let's be real about these things, because I lived check to check. I lived homeless for times. I couldn't feed myself while I was doing work around the world. And I can never, ever, ever recover from that, whether that's my finances, whether that's my mental health, whether that's the kind of work I'm able to do, the work I wasn't able to do for some of the best years of my life that was basically repressed by universities that I was at because I didn't have the resources. And I'm not complaining for myself. I'm saying this is what we're talking about. And I think I want to be really honest about it, that, you know, it doesn't end just because you get a 10-year job. So one of the things that I found infuriating and gaslighting about post-2020 is all the same institutions who looked in my face and the face of so many other people and told us that we weren't qualified and that we were worthless to them, then put out statements talking about how committed they were to Black lives and how they needed more Black faculty. And I was like, go look in the garbage. Go look in the garbage, because there are so many people that were pushed out of these universities, that walked out of these universities, brilliant people that were not able, and across the country, I'm not singling out any one university because I know a lot of Black people. And I'm saying that brilliant Black academics whose work we will never see, who will never have the books we need to read because they couldn't get through because of the obstacles that were put in their path. And then the same institutions that told those people, did nothing to support those people, have the audacity to sign a Scarborough Charter and have the audacity to talk about the need for faculty. And so I think there has to be some kind of reparation before we even start about moving forward. Let's talk about the people that maybe want to come back, the people that wanted to be in med school, the people that wanted to be in law school and don't get to be there. And why do those people not matter when we talk about these things? So I think that one thing I've noticed is that, you know, what we frame as outspoken that is coming out, there's ways that are seen as okay outspoken, which in academia, I think often actually is outspoken in favor of yourself. Like if you like assert how important you are, I think a university will often go along with that and believe you and treat you well. If your outspokenness is on behalf of other people, then you're a troublemaker and you will actually like not see any kind of career. But my point isn't individual, and I want to say that before I end, that I can only speak about my own experiences, which I'm obviously traumatized by, and I'm like emotional talking to people about. But the solution isn't to be treated well. I'm actually treated quite well where I am right now. That's not the point, you know. The point isn't that then maybe one day I can get into a position where I'm now a top dog and I get all the funding and I get to have a chair. And now there's some other precarious Black woman, but oh, well, I made it. That is actually the problem, that the university encourages that kind of thinking where we endure abuse and struggle. By the skin of our teeth, we make it into these positions. And then we're supposed to be successful when we personally get to be on the board of governors, or we personally become a dean, or we personally get a chair. And now we're not supposed to think about all the other lives that were implicated in that and involved. So to say, what do we need to do about Black faculty is to ask, what do we need to do about our Black undergrad students that, you know, are not being chosen for the research projects and not being encouraged? What do we need to do about our Black grad students who don't get the same opportunities, whose work is deemed like not real academic work, who are struggling? You know, what do we do when someone's precarious? So we have to take all those steps and look at that, because that treatment that you have from particularly your first day of grad school is what shapes you into the future racialized faculty and what you're able to do in your job. So I guess I'll end there, but yeah, so we're just going there now, I guess.
This is ongoing. Thank you so much, Al. We're going to continue to talk about this. Your experience, I mean, you can only speak to your own experience, but I can also speak to my experience and say that I have my own horror stories. And we need to discuss in a very serious way, what are the costs, right, involved in, you know, this so-called EDI work. For every success story, how many people are left behind and forgotten, right? Lily, I would like to hear from you.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of my fellow panelists for the candor and eloquence and pain and vulnerability that you're bringing to this discussion. And I'm in awe and honored to share a space with you. So thank you. And I've been listening and thinking a lot about my own experiences. And, you know, one of the things that I've been thinking about as I'm listening, but as I was preparing for this webinar, was what it means to speak within the institution and what outspokenness looks like. And I was appointed as a faculty member in 2004, and I, you know, have been in university administration in one form or another since 2011. No, 2012. I'm losing track, but, you know, a while. And so, you know, a lot of what I think about in terms of, like, I have to say that for me, one of the most painful and lonely moments of trying to do what we might think of as equity work was actually in an administrative capacity. And so and I have not actually talked a lot about this story because I was so overwhelmed by the need to preserve confidentiality and to, you know, all that kind of stuff. But, you know, Elle, what you were just saying reminded me of how we protect white men all the time institutionally with these kinds of respect, you know, notion, the idea of respecting confidentiality. So I'll tell a version of this story. only as a way to sort of offer a different perspective on what speech might look like within the institution and what racialized speech looks like. When I was appointed chair of the Department of English at York, where I am, one of the first things I had to do was cancel courses. There had been a strike, and we needed to change whatever teaching assignments had been done. And I had to cancel courses. The thing about being a chair is that you get to see everybody's workload. Like, you really get to see who's working, I gotta say. And it's really enlightening because it kind of shakes down how you think around race, around gender, around seniority. And so one of the things that I learned as I was going through, teaching assignments and things, was that a disproportionate number of white colleagues taught a disproportionately small number of students. And I was just like, well, this is really unfair. Like, equity isn't just race, it's also around workload. And so one of the things I did was just look at the courses that were I thought I was being super scientific. I looked at the courses that had the fewest students in them, and then I canceled them. And then I told the white colleague who was teaching these tiny seminars, and I was very sorry. I know it was the middle of July, and I know that he's not in the country, and he's in a very sunny location that I won't disclose. But that we were going to cancel his tiny seminars, and he's going to have to teach some intro to English. Sorry. So, I was really naive. I wasn't prepared for the backlash that would unfurl. What happened after that was, I think, actually an international change.org petition, which mangled what I had done, what my administrative decision was, so that the petition named me. It said, Lily Cho, bring back these courses. But the narrative of the petition was that I was killing Can Lit. That I was killing, Canadian literature. So I, as a woman of color, was preventing students from learning about the culture of Canada by canceling these courses. And what happened then was perhaps unforeseen by my colleague, but the men's rights movement got involved. Like, you can all see where this goes, right? My inbox became a cesspool of everything that you can imagine, because somehow I'd become the person who was preventing students from learning about our national culture. And what I learned in that moment was how little there was to protect me from making administrative decisions that were based in equity in every sense of the word. And it wasn't that, the dean wasn't supportive. It wasn't that, people were supportive in the way that support could happen. But so little could be done. Like, I remember saying to the IT folks, like, using email is a really basic part of my job. Like, I actually have to use email to do the job, and I cannot go into my inbox right now because it's full of rape threats, and like, I can't actually look at it. So what can you do? And like, my office address is published on a website, the whole, and I don't, this is not news to anybody. Like, everyone in the institution knows what it's like to be really public like this, and not public because you're looking for it, public just because our jobs are as public servants. And so what I think about in that moment is how to do this better. A lot of work has to be done to make the university work, and there are a lot of people who don't do enough of it. And I think that, when we think about equity, I and it's partly because I come from the position of an administrator, I think a lot about workload in terms of equity, and what it means to speak on behalf of those questions. But obviously there's the idea of the separation between the body and what we represent as racialized bodies and indigenized bodies is also part of that question. But I think that the kind of protections that we might need, that the institution needs to think about, might also lie then in where Elle started off, which is where our unions are. And I think we do have to think about the role of our faculty associations and our unions in these discussions. So I'm looking forward to talking more about that next, but I'll wrap up for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you know what? We will go right to that question. I do think that we need to do kind of a deep dive. I think that this conversation is moving us towards us doing a deep dive into the very structures of Canadian academia that is creating these precarious situations and precarious work. We need to unpack these structures and the history. So I will ask you guys, and again, if you can remember to keep it to 5 minutes as much as possible. How did this current situation within Canadian academia develop? In other words, what are some of the factors that led to Indigenous and racialized faculty members being so vulnerable within academic spaces? And I'm just going to keep the same order. So we'll go to you first, AJ.
All right. Thank you. And thanks everybody for all that you've been sharing. It's been obviously shifting all of what I want to be talking about. I guess the short answer to this, how did this situation develop? It developed because we're not supposed to be in the academy, right? The academy was never designed for us to be there. I think Elle demonstrated that most eloquently and clearly in the contemporary sense, like this is happening right now, what Elle told us about. Historically, this has also been the case. Like, just look, you go back 100 years and look at how Du Bois, tried to navigate through the academy. People like CLR James, people like Eric Williams, like the list goes on and on and on. People who have been made to be educated by their colonial officials who retired into cushy like teaching jobs in the famous universities. Anyway, I could talk about that for ages, but if thinking about it, that's the historical aspect. We were never supposed to be here in the first place, but we're here now. Some of us, not enough of us, and in theory, we're supposed to be here. So, and again, we're supposed to be grateful for being here, as my colleagues have been talking about, and encouraged not to rock the boat. In fact, the way in which the ideal way that we want, it's almost like they want our bodies to help plug the leaky holes in the boat, right? So plug up the holes, protect the boat, when what would actually serve the objectives of diversifying in any meaningful way would actually be to dismantle that boat and build a raft that way more people would be capable of riding. And that is something that we can actually do in universities, right? Like, we are not prisoners to the way that things were done for the preceding 7,000 or 8,000 years. We can actually radically reimagine what the university is supposed to do and how we go about doing things. So I would just leave that there for people to kind of think about. I think the present moment's important in terms of how the opening around EDI, for all of its like very deeply flawed aspects, it has opened up a potential to have conversations like this, where they were completely it's not even that they were unwelcome, they were unthought of, and nobody would even have thought to have a conversation like this in the past. Why did this happen? I think, Idle No More in the contemporary sense forced this conversation, even more so than Occupy did. And after Idle No More, of course, you had the release of Truth and Reconciliation reports, and all along the way, people like Elle and others were fighting for the dignity and rights of Black people to continue to exist in this country. And then that gave rise to, Elle already kind of laid that out, but like it created this, and then this racial context exacerbated by people freaking out about Donald Trump. And then the pandemic pushed the university into this online atmosphere, online space. And I think it provoked some kind of existential crisis in senior administrations around the world, in part because they didn't know what the future, nobody really knew what the future of academia was going to be looking like. And students who had, so I just laid out maybe 15 years of modern history, contemporary history, that's the generation of undergrads, right, who are sitting in our classrooms now. And I think that these students understood that if the professors can't tell them things that matter to making sense of the world that they live in, that maybe they wouldn't even turn up to class anymore. And I think that perhaps this is maybe me being cynical, but that more than anything has created an opening through which universities are thinking we at least have to get bodies. Forget about the minds, but we at least need bodies in here. And those bodies can get literally, we all hear it, right? Asses in seats. This is what the way that this is, that our students are reduced to tuition potential. And I think it's related to all of the other things that we've been talking about. It's clear to me that students in particular need us here, and this is the representational part that Lana was talking about. It's very important. I remember my first day on the job, I had all kinds of non-white students literally running to me and asking, "What are you teaching? Whatever you're teaching, I want to take it," which is like, you can't even be flattered by that. It had nothing to do with me. It was simply, you know, the fact that I represented the potential of something different. But where was I here? Yeah, okay. So I think that generally speaking, we're well received by students. We're less well received by some of our colleagues who might feel threatened by the way that this is shifting ground. So we're vulnerable in a number of different ways. And, you know, by virtue of being outspoken in public in the work that we're doing, it leads to really, and these are things that I think my panelists here all know about, but it might be worth speaking to the broader audience in case you don't know what it's actually like. It includes things like being surveilled by the police about the classes that you're teaching, having your university president's lawyer call your chair asking questions about you, and then forcing you into like hour-long conversations to explain your academic and pedagogical decisions that don't mesh with their expectations. Why they're even paying attention to it is a whole other section, right? Because nobody else is subject to that level of scrutiny. Harassment from organized political interests in the student population sometimes, but also in the broader community. These are things that happen not just to me, but also people that I know in the first year or two of our appointments. We haven't even gone up for reappointment at this point, right? Those of us who are lucky enough to even be tenure track positions, let alone the folks who are precarious. You know, like Elle told us about the dentistry scandal, and I wish I could say that Dal learned its lesson from that, but it totally didn't, because just a few years after that, and when I first started teaching, that was when they accused one of my students and one of our friends here in the community of essentially reverse racism, which was a charge levied against her by a white grad student. And then she was given the choice to, you know, go into remedial race training to learn how to talk about race without offending white people. And this was what was coming from our senior administration at the time. I mean, there's been so much turnover, I don't even know who's in these positions right now. So it's not, you know, but the fact that we can do that as an institution demonstrates a profound disinterest in learning from the generations of mistakes that we've made. And I don't think that that's unique to my institution. Anyway, I could say so much more about this, but I will yield the floor to others.
Oh, thank you so much, AJ. Our institution's learning from mistakes of the past, and it seems like perhaps not. I'd like to hear from Lana on this.
Yeah, I think one of the things too that makes things precarious is institutions saying they want something when really they want something else. And so I see that a lot in terms of, right, we want reconciliation, or we want decolonization, or whatever that looks like. And then there's nothing actually to support that, or nothing to actually think about the material consequences of creating that expectation or opening up that space and then not being willing to support it, and actually in many respects undermining it. So I'll give you one example, kind of what AJ said when he was going through his list. I was like, check, check, check in terms of experiences. So we have part of our mandate is towards social justice. And we actually have a committee here, and it's actually a place where we're supposed to be allowed to complain or to be outspoken. And we were trying to, me and some other colleagues, we were trying to do something that was, you know, in terms of social justice, it was perhaps a step for our institution, but it was even by no means very, very radical. And I was really surprised. I got that call from the university lawyer, and I was reminded of what I wasn't told what to do, but I was, you know, reminded about what our code of conduct is for faculty members. So to create a space where, you know, one of our strategic priorities is about social justice, and then when someone then engages in social justice, that's what happens. So in terms of some of the work and the way I work, I've started to think about it, the work I do in regards to indigenization, not within a decolonizing or EDI or reconciliation framework. I've really started to think about the work that I do actually within a harm reduction framework. Because I think when I work from that stance, it acknowledges, right? There's room for the gray, and then we're not working from this stance or expectations, you know, that will actually have space to engage in decolonization or have space to engage in other forms of transformative action. So that's just something for my own thinking. And I think if institutions were able to be more honest as to where they're at and the limits of their ability to transform, because to me that speaks to that piece around agency, so and ability to give consent. So, you know, depending, I may choose to take on more risk, and be very outspoken if I know it's going to lead to change. So really the aspects of setting up that situation for your faculty members where they think, you know, yes, there's a risk here, but it could lead for change for, you know, undergraduate students, for community. And so people engage in that work when that possibility was never really possible. So I think there's some, yeah, significant ethical considerations and for institutions to think about their privilege of being able, right, to feel good and say, we engage in social justice or we're all for reconciliation, but then really not having to think about material realities and what that actually looks like in practice. So for me, that would be a huge component of it. And then maybe following that line of thought, just again, connecting it to material realities. So what does all of this look like? So if social justice is part of your strategic planning, what does that look like in terms of support? Because I've gotten those, you know, complaints as a junior faculty member, as well, for some of the work that I was doing. And I'll just give you maybe two quick examples of policies. One I hear, right, is always academic freedom. And institutions really need to take the time to really reflect on, from an indigenization lens, from an anti-racist lens, what does academic freedom actually mean? So within our university, we have an Indigenous content requirement, and that's something that's often brought up of academic freedom. And to me, academic freedom is not meant to actually protect against incompetence, right? So I think we have a math program here. If there is an instructor teaching 2 + 2 = 5, I don't think academic freedom would really fly as a reason, right, for why they're teaching that. But then in the same respect, it's okay to claim academic freedom if someone's teaching about reverse racism, where anyone working in Indigenous studies or related fields, you know, 2 + 2 = 4. The fact that reverse racism doesn't exist, it has that same amount of certainty within our field. But that idea that different forms of knowledges and knowing are still understood and seen as non-knowledge, and that, so there's that racism in terms of different knowledge systems, that then allows, right, some of these policies and practices to be utilized or operationalized in ways that can have significant implications for anti-racist or indigenization practice. And I'll give one more quick example. Even in terms of thinking of Indigenous representation on committees, and what that looks like, and thinking about expectations for confidentiality around that. So in terms of hiring processes, right, that's often standard now to have some sort of confidentiality clause. So actually thinking about what does that look like, especially when I know when I am a faculty member being asked to sit on different committees like that, I know the role that I'm expected to perform, right? I'm there to perform that EDI role, or that role in regards to indigenization. So ensuring that in spaces like that, that there's clear language that talks about, this doesn't in any way is meant to prohibit your ability to speak about discrimination or racism that you see at these tables. So that would just be another example. And just maybe my last point to end on is, I know there's often conversation about being uncomfortable or discomfort for settlers who are doing this work. But I think, right, thinking about that from a different perspective. So as an Indigenous person, often being the only Indigenous person in a room for a long time, still in many cases being the most junior person, having to bring up EDI or having to bring up racism, that's extremely uncomfortable as the only Indigenous or racialized person in the room as well. So I think having to, again, in a lot of these conversations, it's always a centering of settlers. So if we actually centered the material realities of Indigenous peoples, of racialized peoples, in terms of this work that universities say that they are committed to doing, that I think that would go a long way.
Thank you so much. And I do think that's incredibly important to center Indigenous material realities, as we are all here due to colonial settler invader circumstances. So Al, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay, and I'll try and keep this to time. Yeah, I guess this is unpopular comments part 2. This is something I often say about, I usually apply it to men, where I say that people prefer the work that men pretend to do over the work that Black women actually do. And I want to now apply this frame into the university, because I think another kind of unspoken thing that happens is we don't talk enough about the class frames and hierarchies in the university. So it's not my position to talk about identity theft as it relates to Indigenous people. That is obviously between Indigenous people and nations. But there's something I want to point out about that, which is every time that these cases are revealed, there always turns out to be a backstory where that person has generally abused other people along the way. There's usually other kinds of harm that have taken place. And there's usually been a silencing, so that there's been grad students and other people that along the way have been harmed by these people before they're exposed and have not been able to speak out. And so when we have the conversation, and again, I'm not centering myself in that conversation, but I'm saying, then it becomes about a fraud or, that conversation, but not about what is it about people that are willing to lie, abuse, and scam their way that is actually attractive to a university, so that so many of these people rise up to extremely high levels. And I think that has to do with the way that universities, and this goes back to what Ajay said, I don't know that universities actually trust in general, like the scholarship of, say, Black people. I think they're not actually believing that so Black women are producing scholarship that doesn't come into its own until sort of like 20 years, 30 years after it's said, right? I have a friend that went to a job interview, cited all Black people in the area, and the head of the department running the search looked at her and said, "I don't recognize anybody in your talk. How do I even know they exist?" Because it was like Black theorists. And then she didn't get the job. So I got derailed in that. But my point here is that, universities can't see that. So when they have brilliant young Black scholars, they're like, what even is this work? Why are you talking about abolition? Why are you citing these Black theorists? What do you mean Black feminist praxis? And can't see it. So when they have a person in a position, it's easier to invest in that person and say, okay, this person's going to get all the grants. This person is the person we push forward. All our news stories will be on this person. So we can have this one Indigenous or one Black or one whatever person, and they're going to stand in for this EDI project. We're going to invest in them. And then it doesn't matter if they've been abusive to other people, or if there's people that, that those people can go away because we have this one person. And so while that's about lateral violence and how lateral violence is encouraged by white supremacy and like the work layers of the university, it's also more broadly about the infantilization, particularly of Black people, and how people don't actually believe that there's many of us and that any one of us can do these things, because there's actually thousands and thousands of brilliant Black scholars. There must be only one. So that one person must be invested in, and then it doesn't matter who they harm along the way. And I think that's something we also really need to talk about, how harm that is embedded upon us. So we go through trauma, and then there's like almost this invitation to engage in the harm later. So it's like, okay, now I'm in this job. I could just try and get out of a labor load myself. I can get into a chair, and then I could get a bunch of students, and I could order them around. And then like they could do all my work for me. And then I'd be like really successful, right? Like that's kind of the model that a university encourages, not collective work, not when we care for each other, not taking the time to stop with each other, and certainly not working with community in really careful and long-standing ways. It's easier to just engage in a model of exploitation, which is framed as success. And when you embed that into the university, then you cannot be surprised that you have a space that remodels abuse, that remodels harm, that remodels exclusion, because it's embedded into the very process. And the last thing I'll say is, so one of the conversations that sort of my cohort of people is having amongst ourselves very intentionally is how to break the same cycles of harm that we were put into by people who were greatly harmed themselves and played out that trauma upon us. And so if we want to not do that to our students, we have to be very, very intentional about how do we do our grants? How do we treat our TAs? Are we making sure that we're taking the time positioning our TAs and RAs, not to extract work from them, but so that we're making them wholer and we're walking them forward? And we have to actually, these are intentional things we have to do, because these cycles of violence are so embedded into the university and they get reproduced. And then this is where I think that EDI models sometimes unconsciously reproduce them, because it's so focused on just getting the representative that it doesn't look at how do we actually build collectively to break this harm and trauma to build something different.
Thank you so much for that, Al. We do have to think about what kind of violent models are entrenched and embedded within the very institution itself, within academia itself. And I want to ask Lily about her thoughts on this, and especially, these ideas of lateral violence and, the reproduction of violence in institutions.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that, I have so much to say, and I'm going to try to hold it back because I want to hear from my fellow panelists. But I think that one of the pieces that I really want to pick up on is Lana's point about interrogating academic freedom and the ways that it is wielded by whiteness in ways that are not at all in line with how institutions can make any kind of change. And so I think that a really important piece of how we got here is really around protecting a lot of different forms of violence and a lot of different forms of colonization in the name of academic freedom. And I have very concrete examples of this from. Yeah, I'm struggling a lot because, you see things as an administrator, and then I'm like, most of it I can't talk about, and it's actually, I actually want to have like some sort of special group of like racialized administrators who see stuff that white people do, and we're not sure we can talk about it, but we see it, and what do we do to change that? But this is a separate conversation. But what I will say is that it seems to me, when I look at what's happening in Alberta, when I look at what's happening in different really key cases around the country and universities around academic freedom and freedom of speech, what I'm seeing are really problematic, ways in which these core principles around what the university is for has been distorted. And then I guess I'll close because I don't want to take up too much time with saying that I do think, Elle, what you're talking about in terms of how to undo the way in which scholarship that is harmful is validated. It just seems to me like the most basic thing, and it's not just citational practices, it's everything around scholarship of care, around how we run our committees, about, you know, every single thing that we do that is part of what makes the institution work, has to be on, you know, thought of through this lens that I love what Lana said about the lens of harm reduction as an approach, you know, to start with the understanding that harm has happened, that reparations need to be considered, and then to think about what it means to move forward from that perspective. And I'll stop there, as I know there's so much more to say in our third question, which you've got queued up, but but thank you.
Thank you so much. And you know what, let's get to that third question, because I think we've already been sort of discussing it a little bit. So let's just move right into it. What should universities do to fix these issues? Are there any practical solutions? And, you know, it's a difficult question. I know it's hard to keep it within 5 minutes. If you can, try to do so as much as possible, so that we can get to the question Q&A. But I'd love to hear from you first, AJ.
I'm going to be so much less than 5 minutes on this one, I promise. I have a numbered list, actually. While everybody was talking, this is what I was thinking of. So 1, take the time to assess at a high level whether you, meaning the universities, are willing to transform how the institution operates. That's the first step. Are you willing to do that? What kind of resources are you willing to dedicate to that? Only after you have an idea of what resources and how far you are willing to bend and change your institutional culture, only at that point reach out to racialized colleagues and others, not just racialized colleagues, but bring the resources first. And it's an inversion of how things work, right? Because everything in the university is based on come up with a proposal, spend 3 months developing a grant that will go nowhere. And then, you know, or maybe you can workshop it for 3 years, and then maybe we can think about diversity in 5 years. So flip that model. We don't have to do it that way. We are autonomous institutions and can decide what and how we're going to spend our resources. So after that, equip these people with the resources and the political jurisdiction to actually do and enforce EDI work. Remember that the tyranny of simplistic democracy in kind of our faculty meetings, people will never vote en masse in favor to challenge the privileges that they have. So we shouldn't fetishize the idea of democracy in this sense either. Like when it's a question of equity, it should not be subject to majority rule anyway. So there's that. And those are big fights that institutions need to be willing to have. If you decide that you're not ready to make radical changes of that nature and the investments necessary to accomplish it, do not do them. Do not try to do them. It's actually better for outspoken racialized faculty if you don't waste our time with half-assed measures to try to institute change. Because honestly, we know what we're doing in terms of caring for our students, trying to do our research. And if we were left alone to just do that stuff, we would do awesome things too. So unless you're serious, unless you can bring these resources, just, you know, no thanks. You know what I mean? Like start with that. Commit, step number 2, with Lily in mind here, you know, commit to finding white colleagues to fill the roles for some of these service commitments, particularly around EDI. Because honestly, like for those of us who have always lived and existed on the margins, it is very much kind of remedial training work that we're doing for white colleagues, or like hetero, cis, you know, like people who don't understand marginalities. So I really think that for the most part, it's like we shouldn't be chairing these committees. We shouldn't be staffing these committees. We should be maybe supporting them if they have questions that we can come in and support them for. That's appropriate. But more and more, I really think that it should be white people doing that work and running those committees. We can decide where the money goes or something. Put us in whatever that committee is. So develop a mechanism to target the colleagues who are performing a disproportionate less amount of service work and force them to put aside some of their exciting research and do that EDI work. We know it seems impossible, but find a mechanism to do it. The next thing, recognize lived experience in social justice organizing as valuable experience when hiring and also deciding where to place somebody on experiential based pay scales. That's a minor, it sounds like a minor point, but it actually, you know, just thinking that because somebody might have taught 1 year longer in some institution, that puts them at one level, whereas, you know, somebody else might have been spending a decade in community service or like political organizing. In fact, those are the attributes that prepare us to do really good EDI work and to do good committee work at the university. And this is one of the, I would call this a low-level irritation of mine since I started here, was that I could never get any actual recognition for the work that I've done that was not waged, you know. So like editing a grassroots newspaper, organizing in social move, all the things that actually make me good at my job that the university wants me to do. I'll tell you this much: it has nothing to do with 19th century Sri Lanka, which is ostensibly why I'm here. So obviously this is not the reason why the university values our labor. So they should actually value that labor. The next thing, apologize to the students. This is with Elle in mind here. Apologize to the students that have been harmed along the way. I'm talking directly to my institution here. So apologize to students like Masuma Khan and Elle Jones. Commit to looking into the Black students who were relegated, as Elle said, to the dustbin, and see how we can invite them back to finish or upgrade their degrees if they're interested, and find the money to support them to do that. These are things that can be done that would actually make a material difference, you know. And you know, I've heard Elle talk about this before, and really I think this is Elle's, echoing Elle here from before, and just saying specifically this is what the policy should look like. And then two last things: stop nickel and diming workers on the campuses. And I mean, you know, the way we do split TAs, we have markers and graders, and like nickel and diming people. Embrace the idea of the CCPA's living wage. Understand that everybody has to work together to make the university work, and stop making excuses for pitting one union against another and so forth. Some of these things cost money, right? Not all of them cost money. And if you can't afford to commit to resources, just stop claiming that it's a priority. Nobody's forcing you to claim that it's a priority. It's a kind of cheap opportunism when institutions claim that it's a priority and they have done no work to demonstrate that they're willing to change in foundational ways. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And let's move to Lana. I really like this idea of, you know, just having concrete solutions, things that can be done. So what do you think, Lana?
Yeah, I had much of the same on my wish list, I guess. So yeah, number one is, let us understand where the limitations are. So don't lie to us as Indigenous or racialized faculty about what could be possible. And also, yeah, having those honest conversations within the institution. Also in terms of representation, but not thinking that we're all the same. So having representation of people who have particular knowledges, and in my case, thinking about indigenization of Indigenous knowledges, as well as knowledges related to anti-racism and settler colonial studies and all those sorts of things. Going back to my comment too about harm reduction. So I'm just drawing from Ahmed's work again, like when they are talking about often anti-racism as being like a discourse of organizational pride. And then when that happens, what happens is it's not really ever recognized and dealt with, right? It's just giving the appearance that change is happening. And so I see that same logic at play in regards to reconciliation or indigenization or decolonization or EDI. So again, I think if we work from that, you know, harm reduction standpoint, universities aren't going to be singing from the rooftop, right? Like I'm engaging in harm reduction, and it's a much more practical place to work from. And I think this is picking up off something else said. Thinking about it differently, instead of this extractive process, how can community actually be built? So Al talked about often it's just one individual being propped up. So how can there be circumstances where it's actually about supporting and building community, which is fundamentally different? So for example, thinking about it in regards to Indigenous education, in order to obtain Indigenous funding dollars, there has to be Indigenous education councils, and those have external members from the Indigenous community. But the way that those are carried out and operationalized within universities is it really helps create a division and mediate the relationship between those internal Indigenous folks and those external Indigenous folks. So there's lots of different ways how universities kind of work to, perhaps purposely, sometimes, maybe again, just not by centering and thinking about concepts like EDI and Indigenous realities, but they work to really segregate us within the institution. So really creating those spaces where community can actually be built up, instead of people getting information in a very contained space. And then it could be precarious, right? If you're only privy to so much information about an institution, and that's what you're speaking from. And then it creates this scenario of being able to question perhaps the legitimacy or counter the legitimacy of the outspoken faculty member, right? Well, the external community says we're doing a really great job. So being able to actually have those direct relationships between Indigenous peoples within and outside of community. And I still am somewhat hopeful. I know we talk a lot about systems, but I always ground it in, responsibility, and it's people who make up systems. And in indigenization, I always have the mantra in my head, Indigenous led, but everyone's responsibility. So even in terms of things, if there's a job hire, ask a question. Take it upon yourself to be responsible, to ask a question of, is there, for an administrative position, for example, give me an example of where you've dealt with racism in the past, or something concrete, because often, again, it's the few voices who have to be that person who at all of these different tables are raising issues around racism and equity, and doing that work. So if more people start doing that, it would be really great to kind of be at a job talk or be at something else and not have to raise my hand and ask that question, because we've already had a really fulsome conversation around racism and indigenization, for example, within our institution. So just having more people take responsibility so that it could start to become and seen more as a fabric and a priority within the institution from the ground up.
Thank you so much for that. Elle, do you have a wish list?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, one of the things I found very challenging as I've been in my first couple of years of a tenure job is I know that if I had the time to sit down and do some grants, then I could set myself up for the next couple of years, right? Like that's where you get the money to have research assistants. But I just don't have the time to do it. So I think one thing that would just on a really basic level be helpful if universities, when you have incoming racialized faculty, like really clear space to walking people through some of those applications, like shaping that. We have a research office. I'm not saying that people being negligent, but I think it has to be perhaps even more hands-on, because it's very difficult. I mean, in the time between you're doing your own work, your research, all the stuff Ajay talked about, being in community, like when am I going to get time to sit down and do like a big shirt grant, even though I know that if I did that, my next 5 years would look a lot easier for me. So I think being able to triage your labor is really important. And I think just even having that help would just do a lot, where you can also, and I think also because we feel that responsibility to set our students up and send them forward, and we need funds to do that, right? That's where we have the research funds to hire students into our own projects. So I think being really intentional about particularly the racialized faculty, like, let's sit down together, let's walk you through this, like, okay, let's do this. Like sometimes I think it has to be more hands-on, because just in the everything else that's going on, it can be really impossible to get those things in place. And that's why we end up, I think, structurally disadvantaged as well. We're just not be able to sit in our office, close the door, and do the work in the same way that other people are, because we're doing other kinds of work as well. And I also think it's really important. I think we really have to be, as community stuff becomes far more into the university, and that's a huge area of problem in itself. Like, what does it mean when anything enters the academy and gets institutionalized? But I think we need to be a lot more careful about what we're designating as community work, activism, etc. So to go back to this theme of outspoken, for many years, if you're an activist or outspoken, that was just the death knell for your career and like, good luck. And then it suddenly became popular. And now even the thing where, you know, community-centered research is now a big thing with SSHRC and so forth. But as usual, many of the people benefiting from that aren't actually the people working in community. Because if you're working in community, it can take many, many years before you have a result. My book took 10 years of prison work to put into like one book, you know? It's not a 3-month research project and I churned the book out and I went on, right? So I think there needs to be a lot more. I cannot tell you how many times people have informed me now that somebody does all this prison work with prisoners and nobody's heard of them. That's like actually in the community, but there's no check for that. So whereas if I pretended to be a physicist, people would know I'm not very, very quickly. If you claim that you run a book club in prison or you do all this work, who's going to know? So there's quite a lot of fraud around that, or people that have gone to like one rally and then are being designated. And why does it matter? This isn't just about gatekeeping, but because this plays into these dynamics, right? Where those who invest the time to do careful work with community end up sidelined and marginalized. And then it's very difficult to suggest that that is actually the way to work. So if you see one set of people shooting up the ranks, doing work in what I would say the wrong way, and one set of people not, like, who's going to choose to do the thing that doesn't advance you? So I think it has to be much more intentional around recognizing those kind of differences. And as Ajay said, like realizing what different work is and not just sort of lumping everything together as the stuff Black people do. You all must do the same thing. Aren't all of you activists? Aren't all of you BLM? And all of this is like, no, actually, we're not all. Like, some of us are specific things, and that matters. And you know it matters because you apply it to white things. You just don't want to apply it to us. And then the last thing is like, you know, sometimes it doesn't have to be doing something. And the reason why I like my job now is because people are very chill and they mostly leave you alone. And that's what I need. I want to share work with my colleagues. I don't need to have a workload taken off me to have less than people. Like, we're kind of in this together. I want to create courses. I want to be part of that. And I also don't want people to interfere with me. And as long as that's happening and I can live my life and go out into community and come in and teach my classes and I don't have to take stuff back from it, like, like this stuff can really overflow your life and it becomes part of your mental health and it's like your identity, and it can overtake your vision of yourself and who you are. And that's very unhealthy. Like, academia is a very unhealthy space when it comes to work because there's no end to the work. It can fill every available minute. So sometimes I think it's just the space for rest. So not the what can we do, but sometimes what are we allowed to not do? And making sure that we just have that room to be, that we can just do our jobs and go home at the end of the day and live our lives in community and with our families and do the things we need to do and not worry about it. And that's exactly, like, that's what I want from my job. I want to not dread going. I want to work hard when I'm there. And when I need to put it down, I want to be able to put it down without fearing for my career and live the rest of my whole life as well. So.
Thank you so much. I want to reiterate that point. What are we allowed to not do? And how is well-being and rest being included in these conversations? Because without well-being, without rest, without mental health, we're not able to do any of the work we do want to do, right? And Lily, please round us out with this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just so grateful for it. And I love thinking about solutions. So I've got 3 things I want to say, or three points to offer. 2 are things that are already happening at my institution. And then 1 is a wish, a modest wish. So the first one is we did, and after the last round of collective bargaining, include a course release program for equity work for colleagues. Not everyone, it's for racialized colleagues. So you apply to the vice president, whatever office, but I can tell you not all the course releases were even given out last round. So, you know, so so to get to Elle's point, you know, not every racialized or indigenized colleague is doing equity work. And so, you know, so the way the provision was negotiated was, let's, you know, it's not like because you are racialized and because you're an equity seeking colleague, you automatically get course release. You know, we said, well, you have to actually outline what you're doing in the name of equity or indigenization. And then we have an Indigenous and racialized committee of folks who assess that and then, you know, decide if you should get course release for that. it's a collegial decision, like our way our research gets assessed. You know, it's just a collegial assessment of equity work, which I feel really proud of. The other thing that we have at York, that in our collective agreement, that I can tell you 100% is awesome, is we do have hiring thresholds for every department on all of the equity categories: women, Indigenous colleagues, persons with disabilities, gender and sexuality, sexual identities, and race. Those thresholds are negotiated every round. And I can tell you 100% if a department hasn't met its minimum thresholds for any category, let's say women, and they send up a short list of only men, the dean's office, i.e. me, kicks that short list back and says, actually look harder. We're not approving that short list. And that has happened. 100%. So, you know, if our union can do it, your union can too. and it's about, you know, numbers do matter. It is very lonely. You don't want to be the only person in the room. It takes a long time to not be the only person in the room. So, so those are things that are happening right now. Yeah, come work at York. And then my modest wish list is, I would really like for our unions, our faculty associations, to publish every year, not we don't need details. I just want a breakdown of how many grievances they're supporting that are for white colleagues and how many grievances they are supporting for racialized and indigenized colleagues. I just want to know, like, let's just get a sense of what's happening. Because right now, I don't know, and I kind of want to know, and I know that my perspective is skewed because I'm on the administrator's, you know, view of things, and so I get upset sometimes when I see things, and maybe my upsetness isn't rationalized or isn't rational, but I would really like some stats. Like, I would just like to know, like, how much time, how much of the union dues are spent defending and supporting white colleagues, and how much of is that time spent supporting equity seeking colleagues. and then let's have a conversation about that. But you know, let's get that information first. Thanks. Those are my things.
Thank you, Lily. I would love that kind of transparency. And I would challenge people, because I know there are various, you know, people coming in as attendees from various forms, from various institutions across Canada and even outside of Canada. Let's have that transparency. And, you know, the various specifics that Lily has outlined in terms of thresholds, in terms of course releases, you know, is it possible? Well, it's happening at York, so it should be possible at other institutions. So that's a challenge that I'm giving to the various attendees to see if, you know, we can try and get those things going. Or as Ajay mentioned, like, maybe we should all just go work for Lily in the chat. But so we've come to the end of the panelist discussion. Thank you guys so much for your thoughts. It was incredibly illuminating. And we do have 2 questions that I would like to read out. And anyone who wants to answer this among the panelists, just make sure, you know, you put your hand up and I'll go to you first. The first question is from, forgive me, I'm really bad at pronouncing names. So Sobia Ali Faisal, who writes, as universities across North America seem to be increasingly cracking down on pro-Palestinian activism among academics, and uppercase scholars continue to appropriate the works of Muslim and Dalit scholars while being complicit, if not active, in the marginalization of Muslim and Dalit scholars. How can we increase collaborations between Black, Indigenous, and Muslim scholars doing political work, both to work against the systems and to protect each other? And she writes, Sobia writes, I hope that question makes sense. For context, I taught unlimited term contracts for a few years until I left to work in community. So is there somebody who would like to speak to that? Just raise your hands. Ajay?
Yeah, I can take a first crack at it. But you know, cards on the table. I come from an upper caste location, through various kind of. So I mean, anyway, all that to say, I take this also as a bit of a criticism, just based on my location as well. Maybe it wasn't intended that way, but I think it's important to interpret it that way, in the context of you know, rising Hindu nationalism and fascism, really, to put a undefined point on it. So there's what I would say, as a person who does come from an upper caste position and who does care about, you know, annihilating caste, but I don't want to do that in an appropriative way, who's part of a Muslim family. But, you know, I would say that there are historical lineages that have long existed, you know, and I know that Soviet would know this, but you know, the fact that Dalit organizers have always borrowed from the radical Black tradition and vice versa, that there have been correspondences even between you know, Black activists, Dalit activists. There's the basis of that in anti-oppression and in understanding how structural white supremacy operates and creates the conditions upon which we think about things like, you know, the nation state, or we think about things like the naturalness, quote unquote, naturalness of caste and race, are tangible ways to think about building solidarity on the foundations that have already been built by the generations who come before us. And yeah, I mean, in a practical sense, I think, you know, it's important to push back on, especially on the pro-Palestinian activists and scholars. One of the ways that folks in my circles have been trying to do this in our professional associations is to reframe the issue to be one of academic freedom of Palestinians, as opposed to, you know, boycotting Israel specifically. I hope that's not a cop-out. It's really more a response to the fact that so many efforts have thus failed to make these humane human rights cases. So people seem, even on the far right, to love the word and the discourse of academic freedom. So this is, in a sense, a way of trying to repurpose academic freedom in a useful way to actually say, well, actually, you know, by not sanctioning Israel, you're actually sanctioning Palestinians who have done nothing wrong. So that's one potential way. And then, you know, trying to use, cite, and engage some of these engagements historically between Dalits and Muslims, and Black scholars across in global connections.
Thank you. Elle, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to just add quickly that I think underlying that question is really the question of what happens when other privileged groups within, say, racialized groups are able to mobilize this kind of language of equity and EDI. So we saw this where I think it was USC, where there was a number of Dalit people who wanted caste added to the discrimination. And then a bunch of like upper caste people were like, oh, this is discriminating against Hindus because you're not directing this at anybody else. And we're able to mobilize this language of racism in order to protect their class position. And of course, a white majority institution is not equipped to understand these kind of nuances within community. And this happens in the lateral violence that I'm talking about as well, like that people are able to effectively mobilize these discourses in order to silence those with less power under the guise that the now powerful person is able to use. So I think and that's one thing why I said it's going to be unpopular, I'm going to say these things. I think we have to talk about them more, like how it's a particularly dynamic now that it's okay to talk about identity and stuff. And B, as you said, I mean, the question is in that way the answer, right? That there has to be a mass solidarity between us, understanding our different movements, understanding how they connect, like our specificities of our struggle, but not buying into, I mean, one of the things that happens in universities too is scarcity. Like if there's a Black cohort hire, it's not an Indigenous hire. If there's an Indigenous hire, it's not, you know, so then we start being like, oh, why did they get like all these hires? We didn't get one, instead of focusing on the broader thing. So that is often brought in on us to sort of split our groups, because only one group's going to get the thing, right? Like we're not all going to get it. So we end up scrambling for that. So I think it's being, again, like really intentional about recognizing that and rejecting those kind of frameworks of scarcity and working together to build, we just have to build that together.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this because just having gone through something recently in terms of that lateral violence that you're talking about, and we're talking about Indigenous and racialized faculty, but not all racialized Indigenous faculty are equal, and in fact, we can often do violence towards each other, and perhaps the academia is structured in a way where it's almost as if we're encouraged to fight for those scraps, or we're encouraged to throw each other under the bus, or to harm each other in various ways, and that's not necessarily being discussed. Those nuances aren't being discussed within these institutionalized forms of, I guess, EDI work. So it is something that I think we really need to discuss and to talk about a little bit more. And there is another question here from Heidi Tideman DeRoche. And again, forgive me, I'm so bad pronouncing things. But Heidi writes, bullying and other forms of harassment seem disproportionately directed at non-tenure track and non-tenured Indigenous and racialized faculty members, but identifying these accurately and not having them dismissed by HR and even department chairs as personality conflicts is a huge challenge. How can colleagues who witness misconduct directed at their peers best be supports and allies in a context where there's so much denial and where institutional power is distributed so inequitably? Muted myself, sorry. Very good question. Thank you so much for that. Is there somebody who would like to respond to that first? Lily?
Sure, I can start. I wasn't sure if Elle had her hand up.
It was a residual hand, but I just need to say that you go first.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, thanks for that question, Heidi. It's such a good question, and I think that it gets to, how do we how do we have ways of recognizing harm when it happens and recording it? Because that's the other thing, is that there's there are so few mechanisms for understanding histories of harm, and that part of the solidarity work, I think, that I long for, is also just the loneliness isn't just in the moment. It's it's vertical and horizontal. Like you want to know that you weren't the only one who experienced this thing. And so, Heidi, I don't have I used to say, tell your chair or tell somebody. And I felt increasingly like telling, that first of all, I know that there's a cost to that kind of exchange. Not necessarily even in terms of career or precarity, although I'm not just saying that that's not happening, but also just the emotional cost of those things. But I think that the witnessing of misconduct, and the reporting of it involves asking our institutions to have really clear conversations about how to do this thing. So asking that question is to also, I think, identify how we don't actually have a way of talking about this right now. And I think about it also in terms of students. So one of the things that haunts me is how hard it is for our students who experience racial discrimination to be able to tell us that it's happened to them, and to tell us in ways where we can do anything to repair, to recognize, any of that. And I think, I in my portfolio, and I'm just going to just plug this in here right now because I don't know where else to drop it, but international students are one of the biggest pieces of my day-to-day job right now, or trying to support international students, I should say. And the Canadian Bureau for International Education did a massive survey. They published the results this past summer. 40,000 international students in Canada responded, and every institution in Canada was part of this. And the results, and I encourage everybody to go look at them, are devastating. And it shouldn't be surprising, but international students in Canada are overwhelmingly racialized and experience racial discrimination at alarming rates, in our classrooms when they try to access university services and in their residences. Every part of our, like it's not shocking, but it's shameful. And so, and then when I think about what to do about that, you know, my first question is, who do they even tell? Like, who do they even tell when something terrible has happened to them? And how do we make sure that there's a record that they've told anybody and that we can then do anything about it? And so, and I think, Heidi, your question gets to the failure of those spaces of telling. And so I think I don't have a good answer for you, Heidi, except to say that I think that it doesn't, your question to me points to the failure of our institutions to have places for reporting and places to hold sorrow, because the first part of telling is to be able to tell someone where you can recognize and that the sorrow and the pain of what's happened first and foremost before we even get to, you know, the administrative pieces of it. And I think that that's, you know, to get to the kind of politics of care that we need in our institutions. I think that you know, I don't want to tell anybody that something bad has happened to me unless I know that they're going to see that it is a moment of sorrow and that they're going to see me in that sorrow and that grief. And so how do we institutionalize that? And I think that that's something that I want to reach for as an administrator. Like, I want to build that. I'm going to build that. Thanks.
Before I actually go to Elle, I do have a couple of requests, Lily. If you could repeat the name of the report on the international students, the survey.
Oh, yeah, sorry. It's the Canadian Bureau for International Education, CBIE. And you know what? I'm going to go try and get the link and drop it in our chat.
Okay. Elle, would you like to speak to this? And then we'll go to Lana.
Lana hasn't had an answer in the question period, so let's do Lana first, then if this time.
Yeah, go ahead, Lana.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was going to say, like, even thinking about the processes that exist and how they're very much there to, right, kind of handle things quietly and contain the issues. So being able to address them when they happen. And I've had this a lot, and I mean, it's still a form of support, but I've had after an incident, an experience of violence, someone will come up to me after and say, I'm sorry that so-and-so did that. So even among colleagues, there's often that quietness, right? Like, it probably makes them feel good to relate. Okay, yeah, I feel a little bit good about it too, I guess, but you know, there's no risk, right? They're not really disrupting their privilege or utilizing their privilege in a public space at all. So I think that's important. Like, if there's those opportunities to actually call it out, and you know, sometimes we have to be having more public conversations about it in those spaces when they happen. But then obviously, to do that, right, I know often there's just conversation about education, and right, so education needs to lead to action, but people need to be able to identify and see for others, like, what that microaggression looks like in their room. So people need to build up that acumen as to that. And I guess thinking from what Lily's talking about too, and from an administrative perspective, and having some of those skills being recognized as incredibly valuable skills to the institution and be included in administrative hires as well.
Thank you. Elle?
Yeah, I think academia is small, and then Canadian academia is even smaller. And then once you start talking about racial, it's even smaller. And I think there's always a default to silence. So the advice you're often given is, like, think really carefully about your career, you know? And even if the reality is, like, people went to grad school with each other, people are going to sit on SURE committees and you won't know. So there really is that question, right? Like, SURE is closed door. You will never know what somebody evaluated if they just don't like you, you know? So there's a lot of that kind of violence that goes around. And so we're often sort of like advised to keep our heads down. Unions are a problem. I remember I tried to challenge not getting a full-time hire, but I was a part-timer at the time. And so the full-time union said I couldn't because I wasn't a full-timer, and the part-time union said it was a full-time job and it wasn't their business. So there was like no one to represent me. So I think you often fall through the gaps, especially in that gap between part-time to full-time. And then the other thing I actually had in like my last year of being a precarious teacher, I won't say which, I had somebody write like full on N-word to me in a paper. And I really thought about challenging it. And then I thought, am I going to go through, I'm headed to another job anyway. And I like let it go. So I think that, and I also went through a process of being like, if I say something, this person's going to go to this right-wing tabloid that's already obsessed with me, that already stalks me, that already, and then as you talked about, it doesn't get framed as what you actually did. It will become that, you are suppressing somebody and, there's a distortion of what the incident was. And then you get the harassment. And I thought, do I want to live with that? I didn't. And it just wasn't worth it to me. And I think it's often made so it's not worth it to challenge these complaints. And then the last thing is I'm an abolitionist, right? I don't believe in punishment-based and like punitive policies. And I actually asked the university to sit with me and talk with me, and I pushed for it and I cried for it. And I felt like that was a gift I was giving them. And at the end of it, they didn't care, So it's like, can we just at least have places where we can, if not go through punitive processes that universities are scared of, at least allow us the space to be heard and have somebody recognize what we're trying to say to them. And this is kind of what you said as well, just like at least a space for healing, at least a space where somebody can genuinely hear you and say, I understand that happened. But because there's always this liability thing, like the immediate jump is to like, is this person going to sue us? What is this? And so you can't get a response. So when you just want a human to hear you and say, yes, that was rough, like you can't get it because everything goes into this like legalized response. So I think we need to create more spaces where we can speak about things that have happened to us without being accusing of being gossiping, of being a negative influence. There's all these narratives that come in that make it really, really hard to speak. I mean, even today, I'm like, Jesus, should I send it? Stop like shit. And then I'm like, whatever, it doesn't matter. But, like it might come back at me in some unexpected way, and it is what it is. But I think we need more of those spaces.
Absolutely. And I'm just so thankful for the amount of strength, I think, and what I've encountered in just this space. I feel like a lot of my own feelings are being given voice here, and I really very much appreciate it. And I don't know if you had, AJ, if you wanted to speak to this particular question.
No, I'm good. Everything's been
Okay. So we don't have any more questions. I will say that there are quite a few people in the question and answer, in the Q&A, just thanking everybody for the guidance and for all the work that you're all doing in your institutions. And again, this is supposed to be a space where we're not just listening, but we're also trying to understand, and we're also trying to engage and bring this into our institutions, right? Because ultimately there does have to be work on the part of the institutions that we're a part of to bring, to address all of these issues that we're discussing, and the various wish lists that we have in terms of tangible solutions that have been brought forth. This needs to be addressed. This needs to be actually implemented. So I would love for people to take something tangible away from this and to continue the work in the institutions, in these communities, especially if you're, in a position where, I don't want to place extra burden on, people who are already burdened, but people who have that kind of privilege to better the lives of racialized faculty and Indigenous faculty, and to provide reparations for those who have been left behind. Let's move towards actually doing that, right? I wanted to name this, I wanted to name this webinar, Don't Just Talk About It, Be About It. I was like, it's a little bit colloquial, but this is exactly what we need to do, right? We have to not just talk, but walk the walk. So thank you so much for everybody, for all of the panelists, again, for our sponsors, and for all of the attendees. And have a great rest. I'm going to end it here unless anybody else has anything else to say. Final things, final thoughts? Nope. Well, again, thank you. I hope we meet again to discuss these issues, to discuss other things. And I hope by the time we do meet again, a lot of this will have been addressed, but we'll see. But thank you so much for attending, for those of you that did attend. And yeah, just note that this has been recorded. And so a recording of this session will be up on Lakehead University's English Department YouTube channel in a few days. So please watch out for that and have a great evening, everybody. Thank you for coming.